Hi, so this next video picks up where the last one left off, and it covers creating an XY scatter plot in Excel using that same data from the previous video, and then also adding a trend line with an equation and an R-squared value. All of these things you'll need to do for this lab. So here's where we left off. We have a spreadsheet containing a few volumes, 5 volumes, trials 1, 2, and 3. These are all mass measurements. The average mass measurement for each of those volumes, and then the density for each of those volumes. But Excel gives us a way to plot this data and determine the density in a way that takes into consideration all of these points. So let's start by cleaning things up a little bit. I left this spreadsheet a little bit messy. I'm going to get rid of these hundreds. That was just to demonstrate the fill down feature. Then I'm going to put my significant figures on the trial 2 and 3 and average columns. These are all the mass measurements. I did this before. I want to show 2 decimal places on these. And then how many significant figures should we have on this density? We have a volume of with 4 significant figures and average masses with 4 significant figures. So these densities can actually show 4 significant figures. So we'll go back to Format, Cells, and show 3 decimal places to give us 4 significant figures. So just a little review from the last video. Now, how do we make a graph of this data? There's a few places where you can go to start making your graph. But first, it's important to decide what you want to graph. And in this case, and for this lab, we want to graph volume. I'm just going to highlight it in yellow here. It's one of these commands icons from the home menu, just so we can see what we want. And the average mass, we want to graph that as a function of the volume. So if you only have one set of trials, you might not have this information. You might not have trial 2, trial 3, and average. But just for the sake of demonstration, we'll use this average data. So usually when I want to insert a chart, there's like I said in the first video, there's multiple places you can get to each command that you want to get to. From the insert menu, you can do chart, and then also all of these tabs here give you all these different options you can use. The charts menu has little pictures for each type of chart that Excel can do. And so pretty much across the board in chemistry, you're going to want to be doing scatter plots. Scatter plots plot one variable as a function of another, and that allows you to see that relationship between variables. Now, we are eventually going to want a line through our data, but we don't want these lines. These lines are basically just connect the dots type lines. What we want is called a regression, and we'll get to that once we have our graph. So we want what's called a marked scatter. Now, when I click on that, there's nothing there. And the reason is because I haven't told the graph what data to put in here yet. So I need to go to source data under the chart menu. So to tell it which data to put in as your independent variable and your dependent variable, your x value is your independent variable. So this is the thing that you're controlling. And once you click here next to the x values, you can just select what range of data you want to be on your x-axis. So I want volume on my x-axis. I've selected those numbers for the volumes. Then to put in my y values, oftentimes you get these squiggly brackets with a 1 in between them as kind of the default. I usually just backspace out of that and then go and click on the values that I want as my y variable. And so as soon as you do that, as soon as you tell Excel what cells are going into the spreadsheet, it generates a graph. So that's always good. Now, if you want, you can name this series. So, you guys are going to have Pepsi, Diet Pepsi, Cola, and Diet Cola. So let's call this Pepsi. And this auto-generates a title. We might want to change that later, but more importantly, it auto-generates a legend. You can see right there it says Pepsi. So we'll stop with just that one data series for now. But you can always go back to when you have the whole chart highlighted, so when the blue box is around the entire chart, you can always go back to chart and source data and add another series if you wanted to. So you can see as soon as I clicked add, the series 2 button popped up, and if I had data for Diet Pepsi, I could start filling in the X values for it, the Y values for it, etc. I'll just leave that blank for now. So we have a decent looking chart. It's at least plotting our data correctly, but we don't have any labels, and this is really not a great title for our graph. So this is kind of unique to Excel 2013. You can sometimes see this in different places, but the chart layouts, if you click on this tab right here, it gives you a whole bunch of different options for how to lay out your graph, where to put the axes, labels, etc. And I typically go for one that's really, really simple. This one, basically you can add, you always want to have a chart title, you always want to have axis titles. And so clicking first on chart table will give you a title above the chart. It's already there, it says Pepsi, so I'm going to double click on that and change it now. And let's call this chart density of 4 sodas. I only have one data series in here now, but I may add to that. Density of 4 sodas is a good, decent name for this chart. For the axis titles, once I click on this drop-down box, it'll give me options to insert a title below the horizontal axis, the x-axis. And so I can then click on there and call this volume in mils. And then I want to do the same for the vertical axis title, the y-axis. You can make it horizontal, you can make it up and down. I usually like the rotated title. You have to put your head on a angle to read it, but typically looks the nicest to my aesthetic. So our y-axis is mass in grams. Okay, so now I've got axis titles. One problem here is they're a little bit small. So if you want to adjust the font on any of these things, you can highlight and go to the home menu and change the font. But one time saver is that it's if you want to have about the same font on everything, the axes titles, the numbers, the legend, the title, you can select the whole graph, make sure the blue box outlines the whole graph, and then change the font right here and it'll affect everything. So if I change it to 14, that's what it looks like. That definitely looks better in terms of the axis titles, but now maybe I want the title a little bit better or a little bit bigger, so I can highlight there and change that to, let's see what 20 looks like. That looks a little bit better. Okay, so now I've got a good looking graph. Then the last thing for this video is to insert a trend line. This is something that you'll need to do for your density data. A trend line is basically fitting your data, making a line that describes the relationship between the two variables. And to do this, you want to click on, so let's say your cursor's out here, you want to make sure your whole data series is highlighted. And so when you click any of these points, it should highlight the whole data series. If you double click on it by mistake, it sometimes brings you to a menu, or or it might just highlight one of those points, but you want to have them all highlighted. Now, when you do, you can insert that trend line over here under the chart menu and do add trend line. And when that trend line comes up, you have a whole bunch of options to format your trend line. You can make a linear trend line, and that just says the relationship between the y-axis and the x-axis is direct. And then there's kind of all of these fancier ones, but we know that with density, the relationship should be direct. As volume goes up, mass goes up proportionally. So we definitely want a linear trend line and not one of these other weird ones. Now, under the Options tab here, there's a few important things to point out. One thing you'll definitely need is the equation for this line, because that's how you'll generate your density. So you want to check that box. You're also going to want an R squared, and the R squared value basically tells you how good a fit you have. And if the R squared is closer to 1, that's a good fit. Closer to 0 is not a good fit. So we have an R squared there, it just popped up of 0.989, that's pretty good. Now the last thing, setting the intercept. The instructors have had a little bit of debate on this topic, but I would encourage you to set the intercept for your graph. Now what that does, you can see it changed the equation of your graph. It used to be y equals 1.02x plus 2.194. When I set the intercept equal to 0, that makes the y-intercept for the equation of the line equal to 0. Basically, it forces it through the origin. And I can actually see that if I forecast it. So I don't have an actual data point down there, but if I forecast backwards, you can see I kind of grow that line right there. Oops. And if I forecast it, oops, apparently I can't do 10. But you can see that that line is starting to approach the origin of the graph. So that's all I need to do to plot my mass as a function of volume, and if you read through your lab handout, you'll see how that gives you density. So let's get rid of this guy. Change that back to 0. You can move things around. You can move I like to put my equation over here usually so it's not in the way of seeing my data. But essentially that's what you need to know about using Microsoft Excel to graph your density data.